packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer J.J. Manella here with Drew Conry Murray, and we're happy to have you back.
Yeah, and today we're going to be talking about, can you really work from anywhere, work from home or work from anywhere? This is a thing now, and lots of people are doing it. And also this is sort of like travel season where folks may be on vacation, but also checking in with the office now and then, or deciding to take a few weeks somewhere interesting and also working while they're there out of the office. So we thought we'd talk about some of the issues to be thinking about as you're working remotely in terms of protecting yourself and your organization. Before we do that though, JJ, we got a follow-up or an FU from...
Drew, wait.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, what was that word? The what?
Vacation. You don't get those?
Vacation. Vacation. Is that English?
That is English.
That sounds French.
Yeah.
I'll have to look that up later.
Yeah, you should try it. It's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, poor JJ needs a vacation. Let's get into an FU or follow-up from a listener. A couple episodes back, we did a show on lab testing, and we spoke to an organization called Cyber Ratings. They test security gear, and the organization had recently released a report on firewall testing, and Cisco's Firepower 2130 not only got the lowest score by a significant margin, the report also gave it a caution rating for those considering the firewall. So Dominic wrote in to mention that the Cisco Firepower's poor rating may be due in part to the fact that it's an older model firewall. He notes that the Firepower 2130 that was tested came out 7 years ago, and the tested version is running software from 2022. He also stated that he heard at Cisco Live that the 2130 is going end of life this year. I did some digging on the internet to see if I could confirm that EOL notice. I didn't see it on Cisco's list of EOL devices online, so maybe he knows something I don't. That's entirely possible. But in any case, just want to say, like, one of the things about these lab tests are the details matter, particularly if you're using them to help you decide on a product or build a short list. So it's important to know the specs of the devices and the parameters of the tests. So my big takeaway is, don't just read the executive summary. You got to dig into the details of these reports.
Yeah, and I think we did. So we had Vic on, and that was, I think, episode 22, where we talked about kind of behind the scenes and inside at labs and equipment testing. And I think we did poke into this a little bit. So maybe this will answer some of the questions. Now, I don't know about the end of life thing, but I do know that the manufacturers, so it's this weird balance of the testing organization wanted to make sure that anything that was used or configured in those tests from all of the manufacturers was something that was publicly available to its customers.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, so if you're a Cisco customer that has this firewall, you're running codes and configurations that would be available to everybody, not something specialized with magic sprinkles in it just for this test. And my understanding from that was also that they did allow each of the vendors to come in and help make the decisions around which product to use and how to configure it within those parameters of this has to be something any of your customers can do. So, coming down to the model and then how it was configured, I think the manufacturers got, some level of input into that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, because Drew, I know Vic said they actually purchase a lot of the products themselves.
Right.
Just to keep it all even Stevens so that there's no, favoritism there. If they're purchasing for one vendor in a class that they're comparing, they purchase for all of them. So that might be some limitation as well. But ultimately, I think the ratings, they tried to suss it out such that it was like value per throughput. I think they tried to kind of normalize across all the different sizes, because totally valid point there, right? The little teensy weensy firewall you might use in a Soho or a small office is not the one that's
it's going to be in your DMZ, yeah.
8 rack units high.
Right.
Sitting in a
yes, trying to process lots and lots of traffic.
I've configured and installed firewalls that cost more than houses that I've had, so. But I think they tried to do that as fairly as they could. You can download the testing methodology from the labs for free. So I would definitely recommend just, popping over there to Cyber Ratings and getting your hands on that so you can see how they picked what they did, blah, blah, blah. Drew's already popped this in the show notes for you. And some of the lab results are also free. And I think he said when a product doesn't get the recommended, if it gets a cautionary rating, they want to make sure that the public is aware and has access to that. And that's across, I think, all of the different categories. So there's some pretty interesting stuff out there if you start poking around a little bit. And it sounds like most of the vendors are working with the lab to kind of do a little bit better job and fill the gaps where they were slacking a little bit or just kind of not performing.
I think most people probably don't have the time or money to get 4 or 5 vendor products into their own lab to throw packets at it and see what happens. So I do think there is value to these places like Cyber Ratings that can do this. And they do release pretty detailed reports that talk about the testing, the test bed, all the parameters they tested, and the results. But again, it's one of those things you have to look at carefully as opposed to just reading the executive summary of the headline and then making your decision.
Speeds and feeds aside, because obviously that matters, the reason that this particular model or product line didn't perform well was because it did not catch certain signature-based attacks and evasion methods.
Mm-hmm.
So really, it doesn't matter what size firewall it is and what its capabilities are. If it's running the same firmware and software and it's running the same signatures as something 20 times as capable, it should still catch that. So that does translate across the board.
Right. Yes, it's not just a throughput question for sure.
Yeah.
All right, we'll have that link to the report in the show notes if you want to check it out for yourself. But let's get into today's topic. So there's a lot of talk about work from home or work from anywhere. So people thinking about working from a home office or maybe even working from an entirely different country from where their organization is headquartered. Obviously, the internet makes it possible to do that, but there are considerations that people should keep in mind. So I think, JJ, you raised an issue in our notes. One of the first things people want to think about is things like crypto export laws and how that might affect security controls you would put in place to protect remote workers. What are we talking about here?
Over time, many months, I've gotten a lot of requests. I think you might have too. And I've just seen stuff in Slack channels, various Slack channels, not just ours, about, a lot of our people, right? Network engineers and architects, et cetera, talking about, well, my organization is going to work from anywhere or work from home, and I'm going to travel and I'm going to go live here or stay here for whatever, 30 days, 60 days. And basically, it's kind of like the organization can't tell me where I can and can't work from because they've already told me I can work remotely.
Right. And they thought you meant you'd be working in your house, but you've decided I'm going to move to Amsterdam for 2 months and work from there.
Look at you, Drew, picking Amsterdam. I'm so proud of you. So Amsterdam might be okay for the technology standpoint. You might maybe get into some other stuff that might impact your ability to perform your work duties. So let me just unpack this a little bit. I tend to kind of have a little bit of a visceral reaction to this as a security professional and an architect, because you can't just go work from anywhere. That doesn't mean the organization is just like, screw you. But I think it has to be something that we talk about together with them, and they do need to know where you're going to be connecting from if it's outside where they expect you to be for a few different reasons. But let's talk about the big one. You mentioned kind of crypto exports. There are countries and regions of the world where the level of cryptography that we use in business is simply illegal to have. So kind of think of it like a drug, heroin, cocaine, a serious drug, right? You wouldn't want to have an illegal drug and be flying around probably anywhere. I mean, if you're into that, you do you, whatever, but you don't want to start traversing borders and going through checkpoints and being looked at and inspected carefully if you are carrying an illegal substance with you. Cryptography is the same way in some countries.
So how would they know what kind of crypto I'm using?
It depends. There are countries that you might enter. You may have to surrender your devices. I mean, even if it's just a secure boot, right? And they boot your computer up and it's encrypted at a certain level. Could be a phone, could be a VPN application. Mm-hmm. So there's that aspect of it. I think how much does that matter depends on a lot of different factors. There's a risk. You could say the same thing. Well, how would they know I have cocaine in my bag? They may not look for it, but some countries, especially countries who might have a more tenuous relationship with the US, or certain countries in the US, or your employer, maybe you're in manufacturing and somebody's interested in your intellectual property. Just like a police officer might decide to pull you over because it's 3:00 in the morning and your blinker is out, their law enforcement might choose to put you under more scrutiny if they're interested and look or find reasons to detain you and your property.
Okay. So China comes to mind. Is that one of the countries that I should be concerned about regarding crypto?
Yes and no. I think China has a completely different set of problems that eclipse probably just the crypto problem, which is that, when you go into mainland China, and it's for this reason that even when I was on international boards and traveling all over the world, I did go to Hong Kong multiple times. I did not go to mainland China because things just work very differently there. There is the, air quote, Great Firewall of China. They do censor everything. They do control all of the packets going into and out of the country. They do have very strict laws. You can't even get to half of the stuff you use here in the United States online or in other countries in Australia, Europe, Asia, you can't even get to them when you're inside of China.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of give up your right for privacy. And that is another situation where, certainly if the Chinese government is involved, and the Chinese government is involved in everything, it's not separated there like it is in other parts of the world where you've got like business and commerce and then you've got government separate. They are very intertwined.
Yeah.
They are tangled. They are married together.
Okay, so we mentioned China. Are there other countries people want to maybe do some checking on if they're going to be working remotely there regarding crypto export laws?
Yeah, I think China is a big one. I think Russia's a big one right now. This could include places like India, Turkey, some, other areas in the Middle East. There are several websites that track the encryption laws about who can handle import and export. So there's export from the US and then there's import into the country. And we can drop a couple of those links in the show notes for everybody to see whatever is most up to date at the time that you're listening to this.
All right. We'll have those links in the show notes. So one of the things that tends to get recommended for folks working remotely or traveling and needing to connect to assets elsewhere is a VPN. I think that's good advice. Let's dig into this a little bit. What does a VPN bring to the table when probably 99% of the things I'm doing are on the web and 99% of the things on the web are already using TLS? So I'm getting that level of encryption and also some certification of the validity of sites. So why the VPN on top of that?
So the number of encrypted web traffic is high. It's probably somewhere between 80 and 90%. Mm-hmm. But still, there's two reasons we use VPNs, right? There's the network access component of a VPN, which is I'm working from somewhere and I need to access a resource that's somewhere else. So let's say, you're VPNing back into the main office because that's where some application or some storage is. Mm-hmm. So that is your, virtual private network that's connecting you from wherever you are to that asset or resource securely and extending the corporate network out to where you are. I think for most of us that work in tech, that's when we think of VPN. The other reason to use a VPN, though, and you mentioned personal VPN, is like if you want to maintain a certain level of privacy while you're traversing other people's networks. Uh-huh. And so even if everything is encrypted, possibly you don't necessarily want somebody else that manages network infrastructure to have the visibility into what you're accessing. Uh-huh. It could be websites, it could be different applications that are online. Even if they can't read, right? They can't see the data. They know in the headers because in order for the data to get where it needs to go, the headers are not encrypted.
Right. There's still metadata they can see. Yeah.
That can tell you a lot about a person. It can tell you a lot about their behavior. It can open up, attack vectors. So there's 2 or 3 different layers of this to consider.
Okay, so we're not just talking security. I guess there is also privacy considerations, yeah. And yeah, you could be working in an industry or a sector where that kind of thing very much matters. Or even just for your own personal, medical or well-being needs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's other pieces that come along with spinning up a VPN on a device, such as like you can, if you want to, depending on the settings, control some of the network services, security and behavior in the way of like, DNS. Again, kind of 2 main use cases for VPNs, but then how it's configured and how it's used will also dictate additional layers of security and privacy that you get on top of that. I'm a huge fan of VPN usage. I'm probably a little overly paranoid. My stuff is set to, as soon as I walk out the door, it will spin up a VPN into the cloud, terminates into the cloud, but that is just simply to, keep all of my network traffic obscured and going from point A to point B, all encrypted. And the platform that I use for that is one that you don't even have to register with. You get issued like this long ID number and you can pay in many different ways. So it is really designed to maintain privacy. I do want to go throw this out, though. I think we should talk about personal VPNs.
Yeah, that's a big issue because generally speaking, I feel like a corporate issued VPN is trustworthy within the bounds as much as I trust my organization. But there are private third-party VPNs where who knows who's behind it, who knows what they're actually doing with your data. So yeah, how do you determine what's a trustworthy or legitimate personal VPN provider?
Yeah. And this is an awesome question right now. It's fresh in my head this week because like a day or 2 ago, we, had a request like this, and it's been a growing request from security officers and security architecture teams of what do I do with my, employees who are using personal VPNs and then they're accessing our assets remotely. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I say is, well, kudos for your security awareness because you have users who care and are using a personal VPN. Uh-huh. I mean, you're laughing, but that's a huge win.
No, it is. Totally.
They care.
Yep.
So I think that's awesome.
Yep.
But then the second thing is, let's peel that onion a little bit, because there are definitely risks when somebody's using a personal VPN, because you don't know as the organization, well, really, or as the user, who can see what, because you don't know who's managing that infrastructure all the way through.
Right.
And there's definitely been resources or reports and research that a lot of the kind of personal use VPNs, and the ones that are free and very inexpensive, those services are in large part owned and managed by nation state entities outside of the US. Let's put it like that.
Okay.
So we know that that's a problem. And so some of the things we're working through right now, I don't think there's a single right answer for this. I think this is something we'll have to kind of figure out together. I'd love to hear from people if you guys have tackled this or thought about it and what you considered or what you threw out. We've talked about, well, would the organization make a list of validated, verified, personal VPN providers and ask their users, to pick one of those? Feels a little weird. But the other hand is, this is where the whole personal device BYOD thing, it gets messy.
It sure does.
Because if it's the corporate data and you're accessing it from a corporate machine, then the organization has full control over that. They can put whatever VPN they want to, et cetera.
Right.
But if the question is, okay, this is my personal computer and I want to protect it how I want to protect it, now we're muddying that water between the organizations. So some organizations might have a culture where it's of a size and a type where the employee population goes, oh, okay, you've already vetted these, whatever, 3 or 4 providers for me. I'll pick from that. Thank you. And then you might have other of us that are going, screw you. I'm going to use who I want to use. You can't tell me, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, if you want to access a corporate resource and you want the privilege of doing that from a personal device, you kind of need to stick within the guidelines of what the organization is willing to do from a risk perspective, or just say, no, thank you, and use your corporate issued device.
I mean, ideally, that's how it would go. But we all know when people need to get some work done, they will find a way to get it done, sort of regardless of the circumstances or the preferences of the organization. Yes.
Yeah.
Tips for deciding, which VPN providers to go with if I'm not using sort of my traditional, security vendor VPN?
This is a can of worms. I don't want to throw anybody kind of under the bus unduly here. I would say just do some research. And there are several reputable sites online and professionals online who have done a lot of research in this space, who have dug into, the privacy aspects of each of these, and the architecture behind each of these. If you can ensure that the company is based out of a country that you, and if you're doing work with it, your employer are comfortable with, that helps. Yeah, I can tell you, I use IVPN. I arrived at that after a lot of research, but there were 3 or 5 in the running that I was considering before I switched my personal stuff to that platform.
It sounds like, I don't know if this is too much of a generalization, but the free ones maybe give a much stronger look at with a skepticism.
I think that's great advice, because nothing is free. It takes time and resources and money to run these infrastructures, and especially if it's something that's hosted in the cloud. So it's not free. You're paying for it somehow. Just figure out how you're paying for it.
Okay, so next topic, if we're traveling, we're on the road, we're working remotely, we're going to have to likely connect to Wi-Fi in a hotel, in Airbnb, at the airport. Suggestions, tips for doing that safely?
Well, back to the VPN.
VPN is the answer.
There's just not a lot else you can do. Now, I'm using VPN loosely. Let me go ahead and lay this groundwork before one of the vendors messages us on the FU and goes, well, what about ZTNA? Yes. So I'm kind of using VPN loosely to describe anything that uses software to connect your endpoints securely to some other something, possibly in the cloud. ZTNA, Zero Trust
Network access.
Network access. Oh, wow. I haven't had my coffee yet. Yeah, ZTNA type of solutions are going to fall into that kind of VPN and VPN replacement technology from newer terminology. And anything like that is very viable here. If it is securing a tunnel between you and whatever you're accessing, that is ideal.
Okay. And one more question before we get into the news. So obviously, particularly on corporate managed devices, you can put host-based security controls on those devices, but there's also a move to start putting those services into the cloud, whether it's SSE, Secure Service Edge, or SASE. And if I'm buying into SSE or SASE, does it make sense to also support like a host-based AV anti-malware, host-based firewall, and so on? Or can I sort of jettison the host-based aspect if I'm doing cloud-delivered security with my managed devices?
That's a complicated one because the SASE and SSE solutions are greatly varied. It's kind of like buying a vehicle. A vehicle might be a bicycle, could be a moped, it could be a motorcycle, it could be a giant truck, an 18-wheeler.
Sure. Well, let me preface this by saying I feel like the baseline requirements for SSE or SASE are an encrypted connection to the cloud provider security services, firewalling, presumably next-gen firewalling, maybe some kind of cloud access security broker, and some kind of malware detection, and maybe some DNS filtering. So let's posit that as kind of the baseline.
Yeah. I would still definitely have host-based security technology because I don't think it's fair to assume that every single packet forever in the life of that machine is going to go through a SASE architecture.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody plugs in a USB drive or there's an Ethernet connect, right? It would be really, really hard to lock down a system to the degree to literally force every packet through a cloud POP for inspection,
Mm-hmm.
assuming there's an internet connection. I don't think there's a good balance there.
Mm-hmm.
So there are going to be times and there's going to be vulnerabilities. We saw that Windows wireless NIC vulnerability not long ago, where we think flipping some bits related to VLANs and sort of attacking the machine directly and getting remote code execution privileges on a Windows machine through the wireless driver, SASE or SSE would not see that or touch that.
Right, because wasn't there like a proximity element to that attack where they had to be in proximity? So yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of use cases where the machine needs some protection there. And again, remembering that SASE and SSE typically, I'm going to generalize here, usually those are cloud native, cloud pop solutions, point of presence in the cloud. And so you have to get to the internet to take advantage of whatever's happening there. And, I think layered defense is still a thing. Something could happen in that architecture. Somebody could accidentally change a setting. A vendor might update something and the behavior is different. And so having some type of security filtering controls on the endpoint is, in my opinion, just as important as having it in other places. I just think they need to follow the endpoint around. Those layered defenses need to be on the endpoint and immediately around the endpoint, instead of back at some main data center that the data is not going through now because you're working from wherever you're working from.
Okay, so if you were hoping that SSE or SASE would get you away from having to do all of that host-based client management, updates, policy, and so on, that's probably not the case.
Yeah, no.
Okay, sorry.
Not in JJ's world anyway.
That's right. You do you, but not in JJ's world.
You do you.
All right. Any other thoughts before we move into the news on tips or ideas or things to think about for remote work or working from anywhere?
Yeah. You know what? One thing popped into my head when we were talking about the personal VPN versus the corporate VPN. And I want to throw this out for consideration as well. Not something I have an answer to, but it's just something to think about and know about as technical professionals. We've talked about some of the complexities with the personal VPN on a corporate network. Let's talk about that the other way around, which is some of the complexities of a corporate VPN on a personal device or a corporate device that you're also using for certain personal uses or browsing.
Sure.
And that is that most compliance frameworks, when they start talking about VPNs for remote access to corporate assets, now I'm back into the virtual private network as in the I'm a user and I'm using the VPN to get to a corporate thing.
Yep.
What they want to see in compliance frameworks is a full VPN, no split tunnel. And I think for those of you who have managed firewalls, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For anybody that hasn't, you can either tell an endpoint, let's just say laptop, to send all of its internet bound traffic through the VPN, or you can do a split tunnel where stuff that's not destined for, let's say, the corporate, application or storage goes off whatever the local path is. Your local, let's say you're sitting at home, is going out your home network.
Yep.
And then your corporate data is coming through the VPN.
So if I've got client server apps, I'm running them through my VPN. If I'm on Spotify or just doing some web browsing, that could be just off to the internet via my home network without going through that corporate VPN.
Yep. So compliance frameworks usually want to see full VPN, no split tunnel. That doesn't work in all cases for a lot of different reasons, bandwidth, et cetera. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense. And so I've definitely written justifications for not doing that, and basically a justification for doing split tunnel. But it's just something to be aware of that most organizations probably, especially if you're on a corporate device, if it's spinning up a VPN, especially if it's an always on VPN, probably all of that traffic is going through the corporate infrastructure,
Mhm.
whatever that is. So it could be, SASE, could be ZTNA, could be a regular VPN, which means if you're browsing for other things or running other applications for your personal use, Spotify, whatever.
Spotify, banking, medical, mental health care, that kind of stuff. It's also going through your corporate network.
Yes, it's also going through the corporate network. And so again, you're kind of in that same conversation about why use a VPN for privacy standpoint. Just be aware that it's possible if you're on a corporate device that hasn't always on VPN or you're on VPN, all of your traffic might be going through that, which means, especially if you're on a corporate device, it's well within their purview to, I don't want to say analyze that data, but know that that data is happening. They're not going to do TLS inspection on it. They're not going to break your banking and your medical stuff, but they might see that you went to whatever UNC Healthcare's website or
Therapy.com or something. Yeah. Find a mental health care provider or whatever. Yeah.
it's just something to keep in mind. Your privacy is important everywhere you go, not just when you're out in the world.
Yeah. And my understanding is that in a corporate setting on a corporate provided device, end users essentially should have no expectation of personal privacy. So you might feel like this is private to me, but legally, I don't think you are protected if you are using a corporate device or corporate assets.
That is a generally true statement. There are some weird nuances. I'm not a lawyer. There's some weird stuff related to labor laws around that and what the expectation of privacy is. I would say in general, if you're doing like normal browsing and you're doing it on a corporate device and you don't have to, then that is within the scope of them to look at. Again, they are not going to be doing SSL and TLS inspection on your bank account. There are certain things that enterprise, firewalls are pre-configured with by default to exclude categories so that they don't accidentally do that. But just by virtue of going to certain sites, they're going to know certain things.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, if you've got thoughts on everything we talked about or, recommendations or comments, corrections, you can always hit it up, packetpushers.net/FU. The FU's for follow-up, and we do love to hear what you're thinking. Let's dive into some news. First, Cisco has released a patch for a critical vulnerability in the on-prem version of Cisco Smart Software Manager. The vulnerability lets a remote, unauthenticated attacker change any user's password, including administrators. It's got a CVSS score of 10 out of 10, and there's no workaround, so this one just needs to be patched.
So I'm definitely not as into the Cisco ecosystem as a lot of you guys listening are. So I don't know what all the Smart Software Manager does, but I know that it manages licenses. And one thing that caught my attention coming from an integrator for a couple of decades is it says that the SSM on-prem assist service providers and Cisco partners in managing customer accounts and product licenses. And so that kind of almost makes me a little bit twitchy there because I think the footprint of that is much larger.
Yes.
If you're talking about multiple organizations in a single account. And then I don't know, what does that mean? If they have any users' credentials or can change any users, can they log into equipment with that? I know you can certainly, I'm sure, manipulate licensing and probably cause a little bit of chaos, but I'm wondering if those things are also connected into the infrastructures and you could log into or access the devices themselves as well.
Right. So if you hit a Cisco partner, could you get all of those partners' customers' credentials? That is a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, definitely worth patching in any case.
Yeah, 10 out of 10.
Yeah. Moving on, the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, or CISA. Is it CISA or CISA? Do you know?
I call it CISA.
CISA? Okay, we'll stick with CISA.
Because that's fun. And you know what? If you do it with spirit fingers, it makes it better. CISA. Everybody try it. Everybody try it. Not if you're driving. If you're driving, don't try it. Yeah. Jazz hands, spirit fingers. CISA.
CISA. In any case, CISA has added 3 new exploits to its catalog of known exploited vulnerabilities, or KEV. This catalog is the U.S. government's authoritative source of vulnerabilities that are being exploited in the wild. The newest exploits are targeting Adobe, SolarWinds, and VMware's vCenter server. I will note the Adobe and SolarWinds exploits are linked to CVEs from 2024. The vCenter server exploit is tied to a CVE that was first released in 2022, so hopefully that's been taken care of by most listeners, but just in case, you may want to check on that.
Yes. I think VMware and vCenter is one of the platforms that is very critical to operation typically, but we often tend to go, oh, it's fine. It's on the internal network. Nobody can get to it, not realizing there is some path to, through, or in the DMZ to it. So yeah, definitely check that out.
Yes. I mean, the fact that it's, I guess, being exploited in the wild is a signal that there's vCenter servers that are not patched.
Yeah. And I do want to call that out. I know I maybe beat this drum a lot, but when CISA puts out the catalog and they add to the KEV, it's known exploited vulnerabilities. It's not just a vulnerability. This is, we're monitoring stuff on the internet and attackers are using this actively right now. Go fix your stuff.
Yeah, it's a good warning. And sticking with CISA, the organization ran a red team exercise against an unnamed federal agency, was able to take over systems and exist in the infrastructure for 5 months without going noticed. The team eventually got full domain admin privileges on the target's Windows network and were able to launch intrusions from the primary agency to secondary partner agencies. Eventually, the CISA team notified the agency of their presence and held weekly meetings with the organization's security team to help them improve their detection techniques and better respond to known exploits. But that must have been a hell of a first meeting. Like, yeah, we were in your systems for 5 months, folks. It's not good.
On the other hand, like the average time for persistence in a network is, close to a year. So 5 months.
That's making some lemonade out of those lemons.
You know what? I'm going to say it's less than the industry average, but the industry average is quite horrible. So it's a low bar to aim for.
Right.
Yeah, there was some interesting stuff in this one. So they kind of outlined what they did and how they did it. And there's a step-by-step description that is in the show notes for you. But they did pivot in, I think, through the Oracle environment, eventually wiggled their way into the domain, the Windows domain, and then just kind of started owning stuff. One of the things that they called out was that there was a password file from a previous employee just on a network share, just unencrypted password file. Like, not that you guys have ever saved username and passwords in like an Excel file or a notepad document. I'm sure that's never happened. But if it has happened, probably somebody's going to get their hands on it. In this case, they did. And then they found one with an admin privilege. And I think they said that password had not been updated in like 8 years.
Yeah. And the accounts associated with those passwords were not in the organization's identity management system. So yeah, there were some problems here.
Now, one other thing I thought was interesting here, though, is they were talking about their initial entry point is a unauthenticated remote code execution bug in, I think it was the Oracle that had a 9.8. So what's interesting from a timeline perspective, if you're kind of reading between the lines here, is that CVE made it into CISA's KEV, that known exploited vulnerability catalog, publicly in February. This is last year, so 2023, February last year. The intrusion by CISA during this exercise was in January. So one of the things it said in the write-up was they got in January. About 2 weeks after the CISA Red Team got in,
they released the KEV.
Well, they released the KEV because they saw somebody else using it against the organization as well. So that's kind of interesting. So, CISA knew about that and was leveraging that CVE before it was in the KEV, basically.
First of all, I didn't know CISA did red teaming exercises, but that's pretty cool. It's also cool that they're giving us like after action reports because there are takeaways that we can all benefit from. One of the things that they recommended to this agency was better log collection and analysis. And of course, getting better controls in place to detect and prevent malicious activity. But they felt like the CISA team had triggered some events that if folks in this agency had been paying better attention to logs, might have spotted them sooner. Or at all, because they didn't spot them at all.
Yeah, lots of takeaways there. I mean, passwords, I'm not a fan of forcing like 90-day password rotations, especially when we've got multi-factor. But 8 years is getting a little long in the tooth for a password.
Somewhere between 90 days and 8 years is a good, yeah.
Yeah, a lot changes in password best practices in an 8-year period, and a lot changes in cryptography in 8 years. So yeah, maybe annual at least, and layering things like that with multi-factor. One of the things actually did a cyber defense matrix mapping with a client just yesterday or the day before, where we look at so the cyber defense matrix takes the NIST, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover across different asset categories like devices and users and applications and blah, blah, blah. One of the things we talked about is, we all do a good job with multi-factor on remote access.
Yeah.
And cloud-based privilege accounts. So, Microsoft environment, Azure, AWS. But what we tend to not do a great job of is kind of modernizing our on-prem infrastructures so that we have kind of robust, privileged access management. We don't have, like shared root accounts and admin accounts. We have strong passwords. We have user attached passwords instead of shared passwords. And then we layer multi-factor onto that. So I think inside of environments, this is an opportunity and definitely a great lesson learned to start kind of tightening the screws down, because we think, well, we don't have to do that because you have to get in, you've got a VPN in. There are so many ways into the network that we've got to start kind of following a little bit of a zero trust mindset of just assume your internal network is not as secure as you think it is, because I can probably guarantee you it's not. And start treating those privileged access and assets on-prem the way you would if they were on the internet.
All right, our last story, and this kind of ties back into what we had talked about at the top of the show. A man has been charged in Australia for allegedly setting up fake Wi-Fi networks at Australian airports and on domestic flights. During domestic flights, users who joined the fake networks were greeted with a dummy page that asked for email or social media login credentials, and apparently, or allegedly, this person got some.
Yeah, this one makes me giggle. I mean, for a lot of different reasons. I like, I love Wi-Fi security. I love Wi-Fi attacks. This was just particularly. So he was setting them up in airports and on flights.
Yeah, and on the plane.
It seems like this is not the first time this has happened. Well, it's not the first time it's happened, but it also sounded like from the write-up, it's not the first time he's done it.
Ah, okay. Yeah, so I mean, I guess this sort of ties back into what we were talking about earlier with, people traveling, people on vacation. It's hard to know what a trusty SSID is when you're sitting there in the airport and you want to get online because you need to check something and find out if your flight's been changed or whatever. So this seems like, pretty fertile ground for attacks.
It is. And I'm trying to remember, we hit on this a little bit when we talked to Stephen Orr last week. So definitely go back if you missed that episode. The security work group lead from the Wi-Fi Alliance was on this and took listener questions as well as our questions. And we talked about some different attacks and news and vulnerabilities. And part of it was, talking about one of the attacks, the SSID confusion attack, and that even if we started validating SSIDs, the SSID is just like the wireless LAN name that you see. That does not in any way guarantee you it's the network that you think it is being run by whoever you think it is. Meaning, if you are traveling and you're at a coffee shop and you see Starbucks, there's nothing that stops a malicious user from just spinning up like this guy did in Australia, what we call an evil twin attack. And it's easy, right? You don't need a bunch of equipment. You can do it from a laptop. So you can set up a network that broadcasts and it looks just like the Starbucks network. And as a user, it's really hard to know whether that's a real network or the real it is a real network, where it's the real network or it's an attacker network.
Yes.
There is no integrity and there's no authentication from the standpoint of you, air quoting, authenticating that network. That's different than if you're on your corporate network and you're using 802.1x. We do have mechanisms for what's described as mutual authentication. The network authenticates itself to the device back to the network, blah, blah, blah. But when we're talking about, guest captive portals, we don't have that. So it's hard. It's tricky. Now, it's definitely not legal, I don't think, anywhere to set up this type of system and launch this type of an attack.
Yeah.
But as a user, you don't even necessarily know. It depends on the operating system and your tools. But like without actual wireless tools, you don't know as a user on a normal Windows or Mac device or Android or whatever, what's what. You just see the Wi-Fi name. So this is really hard to make sure you don't attach to a fake network or a malicious network.
So this person set up a dummy page so that he could capture people's login credentials to email or social media, which he presumably then used to go do other nefarious things with. But outside of that, if there's not a dummy page where I'm giving away my information, if I've logged on to an evil twin network and then I'm doing things that are covered via TLS, like going to my bank or whatever, I assume just because I'm on an evil twin network that I'm still protected, essentially, right? My banking credentials should be encrypted and protected, or am I missing something?
Maybe, maybe not. So I think there's a few different ways to tackle this from an attacker standpoint and a defensive standpoint. So the first is, okay, I'm now connected to a malicious network.
Yep.
And there's a data path consideration and that's what you're talking about. So I'm connected through a malicious network, but we're talking about, zero trust architecture. It doesn't matter because I'm using a VPN or I'm accessing something that's using HTTPS. That does protect you from that suite of attacks, which would really be attacks on confidentiality and snooping and sniffing. But if the attacker is in line like that or on path and you're on their network and they're giving you a dummy page, let's think about this from like a phishing perspective. If somebody sent you a malicious email and sent you to a web page, now you're interacting. And if there's vulnerabilities on the system and in the browser, there's opportunity for malware. And so I don't know from this particular attack if what he did was somehow break the data path or inject himself in the data path. The other thing is it could be a lot of the portals use social logins. So if you duplicate like an airport portal and you add something like a social login, that's very, very common. It's even built into a lot of the Wi-Fi products to just click a couple buttons and pass through Google or pass through Facebook or whatever.
Yep.
So that's one attack vector. So I would say the data path is one. The fake social login might be another one. If you know ahead of time what site they might be browsing to, you could also spin up a dummy version or have a suite of tools that could spin up a dummy version of that site and collect those credentials so that you think you're logging into your bank if it's a common bank. Like let's say I'm on a malicious network and I go to Bank of America, and that's common. So that attacker might have a tool set that intercepts because I'm on his network, right? Or her network. So they can intercept my DNS request.
Right.
They can put me to whatever they want to. I'm putting in credentials. I think I'm putting them in at the bank, but I'm putting them in this fake website.
Right.
And then there's the malware component. So there's really 4 or 5, probably more because I'm not a software and application person, but I see 4 or 5 different types of attack vectors if you are on a malicious network.
It sounds like this person was just using the dummy page to harvest some basic credentials and wasn't doing any kind of man-in-the-middle attacks on other sites. But okay, I guess we can wait for more details to come out. But yes, it sounds like once you have that data path, there are other things you can do depending on your resources and capabilities.
Yeah. So when I was trying to find the link to this article, what I realized is this happens more than I realized it did. I saw actually a lot of Reddit posts about similar things and somebody even asking how do airports keep hackers from setting up fake Wi-Fi networks. There was a travel writer that wrote a post about a year ago that was I got hacked while using airport Wi-Fi, and her banking credentials were compromised through that similar attack. Maybe the same guy, I don't know.
She was in Australia when it happened, so
Yeah, it's probably more common than we think it is if you go look for this type of story and activity. But it also makes me wonder, she found out about it because she just noticed some weird charges on her credit card. How many people just assume the credit card number got compromised some other way?
Right.
And wrote it off. So I don't even know the details. I'll maybe go reread that article. We'll put in the show notes, but I think her name was Alex. And, how did she figure out that it was an evil twin at the airport?
Right. I guess the other thing, if you're going to go online and do some kind of financial transactions on untrusted networks, don't use your ATM card. Make it a credit card.
Yeah. And this is, I think, another play for VPN. I also think if you are going to leverage VPN, spin it up as early as you can. Don't join a network and then spin up your VPN because it's possible that if you're on a malicious network, somebody can, capture those exchanges and break or inject into the VPN tunnel. And it's also, I think, important. Again, I'm a little bit more paranoid than the average bear probably, but my devices that I take outside of the house are not set to auto connect to networks. And here's why. You might go, okay, well, I'm going to the airport, I'm traveling, whatever. But if you are set to auto connect to, let's say you're a Hilton person or a Marriott person, to H honors or to the Marriott SSIDs, you don't have to be in an actual Marriott or a Hilton. If an attacker has spun up the same name, your laptop or your phone doesn't know the difference between the hotel you were at 2 nights ago or the same SSID, the hotel you were at a year ago that you shared or stored on your phone, and the attacker that spun one up that's the same name. It's going to go, oh, you told me to auto connect to Marriott SSID. Here's a Marriott SSID. Boom, I'm on.
Right. Okay. So no auto connecting either. All right. Well, there's, I guess, some safety tips if you are traveling this summer or at any time. And JJ, I do hope you get a vacation this year. But thank you for listening and tagging along for another Packet Protectors episode. If you have questions, comments, corrections, anything else to tell us, reach us at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU's for follow-up. You can also find us on LinkedIn or join us on the Packet Pushers Slack, which you can find at packetpushers.net/community. As always, thanks for listening and stay safe.